Alright, so what I'm talking about is, well, for anyone who watches this later, this is specific advice to one fighter in particular, but I think it's a common problem in sword fighting in general is we get too close to our opponent, and I have my pal over here simulating that. Its tendency through, adrenaline or whatever, or just training with only a pel, drilling with a pel probably too much, that we tend to move too close to our opponent. And one of the things that does is that if I'm training at my pel and I'm training on a lunge and a cut, and we're doing a cut number 4 in this example so everyone can see, if I'm training on my pel, that's great. I can hit it. I'm hitting it with the last bit of the blade, which is good solid hits. Problem is that I have to account for my opponent moving towards me. So if I'm starting here, it's more like I'm starting here, right? At very least. Because if I'm just reacting with my arm, as a lot of fighters tend to do, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that, if I'm just reacting with my arm, then if I'm not clearing distance as well, keeping within the same kind of distance as my opponent, so they move forward, I move back, and it still lines up the strike great. Problem is, a lot of fighters don't tend to move back. And so as I'm hitting, it's more like I'm hitting here, and I'm hitting further up the blade towards the middle of the blade, which might generate a little bit more felt impact on the part of the opponent, but it also means that I'm losing range. I'm risking more by being there. So the advice I'm giving to this one fighter in particular, but anyone that it applies to that might see this later, is that if we take that step back, half step back, I'm talking 12 to 18 inches, so a half step back, and so on my pel target here, I am missing the target, right? The reason we're doing this is to account for them moving forward, because the other problem is if I am coming in with that number 4 strike, I have to, it's a little weird because a pel is a lot skinnier than a person, but I'm not going to get a full extension, right? I'm not using the most of that sword or saber, whatever. So if I take that half step back, I'm going to be able to bring my tip online better. And of course, this applies to any of the cuts, right? Especially when you're getting into a cuts 8 and 7, right? Because if you're too close, you're hitting way up the blade, and if you're too far, it's ending as a thrust and maybe a miss. But so I should be just shy of hitting my target in order to account for them moving towards me. Now, this also matters on thrusts, right? Because if I am too close to my opponent, which is going to happen if they start moving forward, and we're saying that you already missed their blade, you disengaged, you thrusted or cut with opposition, so you're dealing with their blade already. So if I thrust and they get too close, look at all this wasted distance I have, right? Whereas if I take that half step back, I'm here, right? So in terms of hitting my target, okay, as they move towards me, if I move back, great. If I already start that half step back, I can deal with their blade, whatever I need to do, and then thrust. and that's going to give, with my opponent moving towards me, that extra 12 inches or so, because if you lunge, you're moving that distance. If you pass step, you're definitely moving that distance. So as soon as my opponent starts to move in on me, I deal with their blade, and I'm already within range to use the most range I can get out of an attack while still hitting them. So it takes a little bit to work in your brain to make sure that you're at an appropriate distance, but it shouldn't change much in the targeting and the timing. The only difference would be is if I am used to cutting close in, nice bent arm, okay, this close in cut, because I'm used to being closer to my opponent, the only difference is I'm going to extend my arm, right? And as George Silver points out, the arm is faster than the foot, or the arm is faster than the body, body's faster than the foot. So I don't need to, extend. I don't need to lunge. I don't need to step. I just need to pop out that elbow just a little bit to cover that extra distance, right? And especially when we're talking about like two-handed attacks, like Fiore's full iron gate. I believe that's right. Full iron gate. So if I'm stepping in towards my opponent and I'm cutting, I want to be able to fully extend the elbows. We see it in the manuals. We see it in pretty much every sword fighting manual. You're fully extending the elbows, right? Boom. And then I can cut into like a left side woman's position. That doesn't really matter, but if I start too close to my target, I'm going to choke up because I have a wall here, but if I start too close to my target, I'm hitting with bent elbows. I'm not going to get full force out of it. I'm not going to get full extension. I am not as safe. Even if I do hit my opponent first and I do get a block afterward, if we're doing like HEMA with afterblows, right? Or we're doing lightsabers where it's just first contact, I have more of a likelihood of it being definitive that I hit first if I come out in front, right? So taking that extra half step back shouldn't change much because we're already cutting through the target anyway. We're already, cutting through. We're already going to this position anyway. We're just going to do it earlier, right? So it might shift your targeting over a little. Shouldn't really change things too much. Same thing with these kind of one-handed thrusts or even a two-handed thrust. If I start too close, I'm going to get jammed up, right? Especially because these are not sharp, right? Like Meyer says to plant your blade in your opponent's chest and, throw them off kind of thing with the fetters. Same kind of thing, but we want to be hitting back here at the tip. Now, an argument can be made that you need to strike deeper than that, but I'm not talking about surface impact, right? Because one, if they're charging at you, it's going to go deeper anyway. If we're talking the like martial arts kind of side of things, like actually doing damage to an opponent in a Mortal Kombat situation, right? So if they're already charging at me, I'm going to get more penetration out of it. Whether it's a thrust or a cut, I'm going to get more penetration out of it. If they're not charging at me, surface cut's still good, right? Do I need to cleave them in half with every strike? No, right? Especially when you start looking at like stick-based martial arts like Eskrima and things like that. It's not so much about breaking their arm in half with every strike. But, if a couple strikes in, you're still safe and your opponent drops their stick, that's great, right? Alfred Hutton Cold Steel talks about 6 inches, right? 6 inches of 6 inches of cold steel going through your opponent's arm to end a fight. So, that's not a whole lot of penetration, right? And we can still thrust, we can cut, we can do whatever we need to. We're just starting a little further back, which keeps us a little safer, makes it a little more definitive for the judges, and also gives us that full extension that's actually going to outreach a lot of opponents. And this is starting to get into what I normally refer to as predictive fighting, where you're relying on your ability to predict your opponent's reaction to something. So it's something that takes a lot of work. Maybe you're going to have to bait them in, or that area of discussion is something that takes a lot of work. But, if we think about it in terms of baiting your opponent, right? I might bait them by leaving my arm more extended so they think that's open, which preps me for an inside block and a stab, right? Something of that nature. So we're all already doing it. If you bait, if you feint, if you do anything other than the 8 basic cuts that Hutton prescribes, or Angelo before him, if you do anything else, you're probably already venturing into that range of predictive fighting, right? Where you are predicting where your opponent's going to be and you're meeting them there, rather than letting them hit you, right? Or relying on a static target like a Pell. And Pells can provide a lot of great training, but there's some problems with it, and one of those is that you tend to get way too close. So those are some thoughts on that subject. So.